podcasting is not going to answer your marketing issues, but everything else that you do in your traditional marketing is going to be easier and more cost effective with a podcast.
Right.
And I think the whole reason is because you're top of mind, right? If you're doing a good job with your podcast, then I need to hire someone who does some wildly niche thing. Let's just say makes cat collars. And this person's showing up in my feed, and I've been thinking about buying a dang cat collar for 6 months. I'm just saving up money, and I'm listening to the cat collar podcast on my Instagram. They're top of mind. And when I'm ready to make that decision, and maybe they push an ad through Instagram and it just happens to find me, like, because that podcast exists in my universe, like, it's going to make that purchasing decision easier.
Welcome to the Creators Corner Insights, the podcast where we dive deep into the mind of creators, storytellers, and innovators shaping the creative landscape. I'm your host, Doublepulse, aka Steven, and today we have an incredible guest joining us. None other than George Boyd. He is not only the mastermind behind Cut the Pod, which is a platform dedicated to elevating podcast production to expert video editing, but he's also a seasoned storyteller and video editor who has worked with some of the biggest names in the industry, including Disney, Meta, and NFL. With years of experiencing crafting compelling narratives and building trust with audience, George has mastered the art of using video to enhance podcasts, engage audience, and drive results. Whether you are a podcaster, content creator, or just simply curious about the intersection of storytelling and technology, you are in for a treat. So, without further ado, let's welcome George Boyd to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Steve, aka Doublepulse.
Yeah, pretty much I go by either. My online persona, I usually go by Doublepulse, but it's weird when you're trying to balance
Hey,
this gaming persona. There's just so much elements to it. You were telling me before we had jumped on the call that you've been like super busy because we have tried to get around these podcasts and schedule a whole time. And my first question, or I would say it's not really more of a question, but it's more of an observation that when you're getting guests or clients for podcasting, it takes like 20 to 30 emails, DMs to just set up that interaction. Would you say your experience has also been pretty similar to that?
oh, absolutely. It's herding cats, right? Because running a podcast business, I get paid for making
Mhm.
podcast episodes. Often, that means I'm relying not on my podcast host to show up and record. I'm relying on my podcast host guests to show up and record. So the trickle down effect can be pretty big whenever you don't lock down your guest, and it's hard because you're relying on the life of two humans to align all at once. And as we know, working from home and whatnot in today's world, a lot of life can enter the work world these days.
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely agree with that one. What would you say though are like some of the more core elements of a podcast that would help captivate and retain an audience?
I think it all starts first with really knowing who your podcast is talking to and why you're talking to them, right? Because
Mhm.
if you know who you're talking to and what they're going to find interesting, you got a starting point. And then you just got to do a good job of doing that part of the talking and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's like quality's got to show up somewhere. And the quality can show up in your market research. It can show up in your production. It can show up in your questions, your
Mhm.
responses. You don't have to hit the bullseye on every single one of those, but you should probably hit it on at least one.
Yeah, the quality is definitely a huge deal into that. And I think one of the things that most people also focus too much by going into the quality side is they often misinterpret that for perfection or trying to gauge the conversation too harshly. So I've always felt with podcasts are meant to be like an authentic conversation. And when you compare it with traditional interviews, even though in a way we're both doing an interview, I can't control the area of I can't control what you're about to say. Whereas with traditional media, the questions and the answers are very much dictated like before people even hop in the hot seat.
That's right.
So,
There's no storyboard for this interview here, right? Yeah, we're not showing up with preconceived plans
no.
or anything of that nature. So yeah, and there's like always people love to use that word authenticity, which sometimes is an excuse of a word to mean you're going to do no work and just show up.
Mhm.
But there totally is like a that lack of production, if you want to call it quality. And maybe it's just like a lack of polish can like really help drive a
Mhm.
podcast a little bit. Not in every element of the way. If you're exposing technical issues through a lack of editing, that's not really authentic. But
Right.
if you do something that lets people engage and dive in and feel part of the conversation, you got authenticity. And production can take you to that place as well. It's not an enemy of authenticity in any way.
Yeah. For you, what would be considered the definition of authenticity in an authentic podcast versus, say, an inauthentic podcast?
I would say the definition of an authenticity in an authentic podcast is going to be one where there's a lot of, let's call it, preparation before
Mhm.
that podcast, and which allows the host and or the guest to show up just like with ammunition, and they can show up, they can have this strong engaged conversation that's a real conversation. And I think that is huge, is that you're able to have a real normal conversation. And at the end of the day, that's it. And if you need to prop up that conversation through production to help it out, then you're helping it out. But to that note, the other end of the inauthenticity could be, there's a lot of ways you can get inauthentic
Mhm.
podcasts, right?
Yeah.
But I think the like maybe like the cardinal sin, the one you want to avoid the most, is when you're doing the podcast for you yourself and you got no direction, you've got no end goal, and you just show up and you have no plan. Like it's
Mhm.
just not, there's, you got to have a North Star for things to feel real and guided and strong. And without that North Star, it can crumble quick.
Even if there's a little bit of an outline or a little bit of preparation, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because I've even done it in the past where I would do commentary videos. And even though that's not technically a podcast, it is very much a situation where I find myself rambling a lot. I find myself going off course and going off topic. And there's this sort of battle in between myself where if I want to go off the cuff and continue going down this sort of, oh, off the cuff and just spilling out whatever I'm saying, or do I want to do a more preparation in script and outline? And what's a trip and what I found is that even though the scripted and formulated response in the initial run feels like it would be a more inauthentic approach, the audience resonates it better than if, say, I was just going off of a tangent.
Because they
It's
can like follow your thinking and your thoughts more so. Is that what you
yes,
stand?
yeah,
Yeah.
pretty much, yeah. And I think one of the other key elements that I think it really affects is the storytelling aspect of it. So,
Mhm.
how do you approach storytelling in a podcast to make it, say, engaging and more memorable?
It's a great question because so much of that like ultimately relies on the talent
Mhm.
and how they show up to the mic. But regardless of whether they show up with an A plus or a F minus, like I'm taking the same approach. And it's, I think the storytelling in the podcast can be through, it's conducted to me, it's through editing. Like oh, so much of it is through editing. And it's like, what are you going to choose to keep in that podcast and keep out? And you can have golden gems that might be bangers online. And by removing them, you're actually strengthening the story, right?
Hmm.
It can be counterintuitive. Like that's a pretty rare example, but the gist of this point I'm making is that you need to choose what's going to be there in that podcast and what's not. And you are conducting a story in that process of helping someone who is listening and or watching be guided through this conversation in a way that builds upon itself, has peaks and valleys, and ultimately becomes a more enjoyable experience because of the decisions you're making in the editing process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, no, that does. I go back to the editing term, killing your babies. As extreme
Mm-hmm.
as that sounds, The one of the hardest things as even a video editor as myself is deciding what am I going to keep in for the story, or is this going to be, because one of the interesting things is you could have so many hidden gems or so many like good moments of a video that if it doesn't fit the video theme or it doesn't fit the podcast theme, as much as you love it and as much as it's compelling enough to keep, you may have to not so much scrap it, but you may have to just remove that portion and save it for later rather than trying.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
What would you say
I
for you has been a actually, no, go on, but and then I'll get to my question.
oh, no. So I was just gonna say there's something that an old mentor used to always tell me that I loved. I hated to hear it, but he'd always said when you're editing a video, whatever you love the most is gonna be the first thing that your client asks you to remove. And this is more pointed towards me as a younger editor or anyone as a
Mhm,
younger editor because you've got a story. You get excited about maybe you've been learning how to do something in Cinema 4D and you're like, oh man, I'm gonna bring in a 3D element into this. And you do it, but that might not be fitting to whatever you're making. And you can get excited about something as an editor or something how to do, and you might shoehorn it into a place that it doesn't fit. And you're excited about it, and therefore you're treating it differently, and it's getting treated independent of the story, and it can stick out like a sore thumb despite the quality that's behind it. And it proved true a lot for me when I was beginning to edit and would go through client reviews and they'd be like, that super cool quick cut I did that ended on a big, huge, beautiful scene they're asking to remove. And I'm like, they're crazy. But ultimately, you learn what you're doing in storytelling and you understand, like, oh, 2 years later, you're like, I get it. I understand. I was treating that different. And so it just didn't dovetail into the story very well.
what would you say was an example of that for your, say, podcasting side of stuff? Because I know you said you're pretty new in podcasting right now.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm about 6 months into launching Cut the Pod, the podcast business.
Mhm,
And I've worked on so many things over the past 5 or 6 years since the pandemic, basically, that I would call a podcast that didn't have the podcast label. But a good example of that in the podcasting world is going to be like, it could be graphics, right? Like maybe you've got some really big, strong graphics and they just don't fit. But you're looking for excuses to use and you're pulling up full frame quotes on
mhm,
areas that aren't powerful enough to deserve a full frame quote because you really like that animation style that you might have in your back pocket.
mhm,
And so it's just being highly intentional and choosing, killing your darlings, if you will, like choosing when you're going to use those few moments you've got as an editor to really turn the dial. Because if you turn the dial the whole time, it's going to dilute itself and not be
mhm.
so special.
Yeah, for example, it's funny you bring that up because I ran across 2 examples that I have experienced from editing other videos that I'm working on for clients, but along the idea of also of another podcast that I watched
Hmm.
recently with the editing podcast, and the
Oh, yeah.
video was about how with the most recent movie, Wolverine versus Deadpool, where
Hmm.
they had took different approaches to editing, where they decided to cut the music at parts that you would expect the music to go on, or you would do something
Yes.
that seems very unconventional. And one of the challenges that I'm having as an editor, but I'm also working with my client on, is my client, he trusts my ability to edit, but at the same time, it's like the he has a vision of how he wants his brand to be. So I
Yeah.
sit here thinking to myself, like I talked to him today, and it was this idea where as an editor, I'm like, and he's giving me full free reign to try everything. So I could toy around and play adding this effect. I asked him, "Are you okay with experimentation?" He says, "Yeah, I'm totally okay with experimentation." But it's like, how much of it will I feel like the editing and experimentation is going to go a little overboard in the sense of where it ruins or tarnishes the branding that he's trying to build? Because of an editor,
Hmm.
what I think a lot of people don't understand, and this goes for podcasting and video editing, is a podcaster's job is to be invisible, right?
Yes.
So I'm sitting here always trying to balance between that act and figuring all that.
Oh man, that it's my favorite quote is the editor has failed the moment he's been noticed.
Oh,
So when you say that invisibility, I love that.
yeah. Like, I'm
And
putting together an edit right now for a friend, and it's like it's very subtle, but at the same time, it's like he's like, "Whoa, this is gonna be an amazing edit," and I'm like, in the back of my mind, I'm gonna let it go, and I'm gonna keep with it, but I'm like thinking at the back of my mind, I know that people are not gonna pay attention to this as much as we are making a big deal of.
mm,
And if
it's
they,
just often the case. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
The quote that I love from video editing world that you were mentioning earlier with the editing podcast and like the Wolverine, how they're experimenting with bringing the music out. It's like another thing. I think another like way to look at video editing is you're setting up patterns
hmm
and then you're breaking those patterns. And when you break them, you always got to have a reason, right? Like it's a super because you can get someone into a monotonous tone and kind of lull them to sleep, and then you break something, music disappears, and all of a sudden someone subconsciously starts to pay a little bit more attention. And little tricks like that are in our toolbox all the time, and it's using them sparingly to make sure they hit and being so intentional about like, all right, I'm gonna use this trick right now.
when it or to go back to a minute when it comes to podcasting and trust, what role would you say consistency play in building the trust with a podcasting audience? And how do you ensure this tone and quality it pretty much aligns with the hostess brands or values while adding your
Hmm.
own special touch to it?
Yeah, I feel like trust and consistency go hand in hand, where it's like you're having a essentially you're having a conversation with every release of content with your audience. If they choose to listen, they're engaging in a conversation with you in a way. And so the longer and the more consistent you can be to allow that engagement to go between your content and your audience,
Mhm.
the more consistent you are with that, as in like cadence of releasing. I release every week and you stick to that, like you're just building a stronger sense of trust by simply just being present,
Mhm.
staying top of mind. And that comes through in every way, shape, and form with that consistency. Like step one is actually showing up and releasing the episode. Step two is the consistency in the quality, right? If you show up with this mic that I've got on right now, and then all of a sudden I decide I'm going to record the whole thing on my iPhone for episode 7 and I don't call any attention to it, like people are going to be like, this is different. And this is not what I've been listening to the past 6 months or 6 weeks or whatever it may be. And so I think it's, and that same level of consistency can go through production, through camera quality, through graphics, like whatever you decide you are as a brand, you got to stay true to that and stay super consistent so people can continue to have that ongoing relationship with it. And the more time you got with them, the more trust you earn with them.
So it's about setting the expectations of what you're going to perceive and bring out before you even bring out the episode.
Totally. If you're gonna be like, you know what, I'm gonna do a podcast, I'm gonna spend a ton of money on the first episode and make it a super duper banger and bring out the bazooka and fire it in the air. And then all you have left for the episodes 2 through 10 is a BB gun. They're like, that's not, this is not what I showed
For
up
real,
for.
yeah. It's almost better. It's almost better if you started small and you started with a BB gun and then work your way up to the bazooka.
That's, yeah, there's your storytelling there too, huh? Absolutely.
Because I've seen it happen with so many times, and even with some of the clients that I've worked with, where they fall into the thing that we all love to call pod fade, where they start many episodes. And even myself included with this exact podcast, I started the first 3 episodes of this podcast absolutely strong. It was episode week after week. And then I got 3 episodes in and it faltered off. And it didn't actually pick up until literally like last month when I turned around and decided to go to this fan expo and pick up more guests.
Nice.
But I
Hmm.
think I think the biggest difference between somebody who experiences pod fade for a legitimate reason of, oh, whether you're working on another project, whether you're working for a guest, versus the difference between somebody having pod fade for the lack of vision is that sort of expectation of where you're taking the show. So, for
Yes.
instance, I haven't had an episode out until what 3 episodes went on, and then 4 or 5 months go by, or however many months go by. and my expectations were not met properly. So, okay, what's going on? And then you figure out what's the problem. And one of the biggest issues that I have ran across, and we've even discussed this in the DMs, is there is a problem where with podcasting, people want to make them so much guest centric versus topic centric, going back to what we discussed earlier.
Mhm.
So how do you would you say you are more when you do work for podcasting, are you more of a guest centric podcast or are you more of a topic centric, and how do you balance those 2?
I align so strongly with the brand behind the podcast, right? So all my
Mhm.
clients that I work with, I really make sure that there's a business behind the podcast, which means there's a brand behind the podcast. There's some sort of monetary goal behind the podcast.
Mhm.
That's because I come from the marketing world and I got to make it fit what I know. And so, for instance, two of my clients, one of them has a service business, one of them sells digital courses. And that service business that she runs is the brand behind that is my North Star. So every single thing needs to, every guest that comes on, every question that's asked, we need to do our damnedest to make sure that it aligns with that service business because it's our ultimate goal, right? And then for the one with the digital course, it's like any guest, anyone we bring on needs to fit in that universe of your digital course. If you're talking about dogs, like we shouldn't bring on a famous French chef because you have a connection with him. Like
Right.
it's not going to work out. So really, it's just finding out. For me, my North Stars are always the brand behind the podcast and making sure that everything falls into the universe that is that brand.
And hopefully that brand is gonna make the money for it too.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Mhm. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one of the biggest key elements I can even add on to that is making sure the podcasts are on the websites of whatever client you're dealing with, front
Mm,
on center. I work with a client of mine that I did actually is the one that pays most of the podcasting. And we found out it's a company that's called Theraclad, and it's with these architecture and innovation type things. And the podcast is directly on their website. And one of the things we find is once you get the podcast on their website, the likelihood of them removing the podcast off that website is like very low. So if you
mm.
set it up to where you give them the first 2 episodes for free and you go, "Hey, we're gonna get you set up. We're gonna do all the heavy lifting on the show. We'll get you the guests, we'll get you this." I have found out that, and even you have experienced this, but do you feel like traditional marketing isn't quite fit, then maybe this is harsh to say it, quite not quite fit to run a podcast, and you need a more creative, dedicated podcast team for that?
In terms of the way I see it is like, and let me know if this answers your question, but the way I see it is like podcasting is not going to answer your marketing issues. But everything else that you do in your traditional marketing is going to be easier and more cost effective with a podcast.
Right.
And I think the whole reason is because you're top of mind, right? If you're doing a good job with your podcast, then I need to hire someone who does some wildly niche thing. Let's just say makes cat collars.
Mhm.
And this person's showing up in my feed, and I've been thinking about buying a dang cat collar for 6 months. I'm just saving up money, and I'm listening to the cat collar podcast on my Instagram, and they're releasing. They're top of mind, and when I'm ready to make that decision, and maybe they push an ad through Instagram, and it just happens to find me, like because that podcast exists in my universe, like it's
Mhm.
going to make that purchasing decision easier so long as I align with them. If I don't like them and I see their podcast 10 times, I'm not going to like them. I'm not going to want to buy from them. But for those people that do like you and are interested in what you offer, the podcast is going to make all your other traditional marketing, I think, more effective.
Mhm. It's the podcast is its own marketing tool as well. So
Yeah.
you
It's like grease for your actual marketing tools. I would almost imagine like it's going to make everything else work better, but it's not, grease itself isn't going to solve your problem.
Mhm. No, that makes sense 100%. When it comes to some of these challenges with podcasting, what do you think are some of the most common mistakes podcasters make that hinder their growth?
What's funny is I think the biggest one is what we were just talking about is pod fade. Like I have so many clients who release episode 1 and not anything else. And that's what I think the biggest challenge is consistency, which is like completely changed what I do. Like when I built this business idea, I was like, I'm going to make podcasts and make them really beautiful visual things that have consistent branding throughout it. And I
Hmm.
build these great podcast structures and then they never show up for episode 2. So I was like, man, how do I fix this? And
Hmm.
so then I started taking over clients' YouTubes. And now they might release episode and then I post everything on the YouTube and they're like, I don't have anything to post on YouTube. I got to do another episode. And so it's almost like I'm trying to solve the issue, which is consistency on my own end, which has been difficult, to tell you the truth. So that's problem number one is consistency, because I think that's actually the answer to everything. Like you got to show up and record to have a podcast. And I think the biggest issue people have with podcasting is they don't show up to record.
Why do you think people struggle with consistency so much out of
I, th-
everything? It's
I
the
think we're too busy and it's like something you can skip, right? Like you can skip it and your business isn't going to disappear. And I think that becomes the issue. So I don't know what you've done, Steve, but I always think like I'm planning on launching a podcast in 2025. And I think I'm going to build 3 episodes and not release them until something goes awry. And then I can save myself with those 3. So I always tell clients have 3 break in case of emergency episodes.
no. That definitely sounds like a yeah, consistency is something I think a lot of us all kind of struggle with, and one of the things that even people that I've worked with always struggle with is they have to identify what's the pain point. Like what's going to turn that no into a yes and what's going to make them be like, "Hey, we got to get this off the ground. You're losing out on this amount of money by not incorporating your podcast into your marketing strategy."
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
in what I find is that because people are so busy with their current marketing strategies and they're so into that comfort zone, and they may not even have the experience, that's where that service that I know that you provide, that done for you, alleviates some of that pressure. But even then, it's not the full answer. It's somebody when whether it's because I found out that most of the time the CEOs are interested in doing the podcast, but it's the
Oh yeah.
marketing teams that are actively unsure about it. They're like, "Yeah, we don't have the budget for this," or they're the ones that sway and turn the CEOs to say, "God, we'll look at this later." Which is ironic to you because the CEO runs and leads the company. In some elements, it's like the marketing team probably underlyingly knows if we get a podcaster and he outperforms all of us, that just means that we are not doing our jobs properly. So
Yeah.
that's what I've always that we have been finding out. I'm even trying to find with my client what's the pain points. How do we pivot and like position ourselves to where you don't have to do anything. The only thing that if you're the guy who wants a podcast done, the only thing that we ask of them is to put it on their website, have the little URL link, put it on their
Yeah.
website, and just share it out. And we will take care of the guests. We'll take care of the editing. We take care of
Wow.
all of
Yeah.
that. And once they see it in action, and I think once the people who see this in action see this and they have it on their website and they say, "Oh wow, it actually is providing us results," then that's usually they're convinced. It's
I can see that though. It makes sense. And it's funny, I've been racking my mind about solutions to that issue.
mhm.
And I haven't implemented anything beyond what I shared earlier, but one thing I've been thinking about is can I like build a batch recording schedule that's just like a thing I have on my back pocket that's like, hey, I know you can't do this every week. I know you can't do this every month, but could you give me 2 days next month on the first Tuesday and the last Tuesday where you do 3 episodes in a day or you do 2 episodes in a day or something, and it buys us 4 episodes could buy you 4 months. And so then they only have to record 3 times a year. Just something there's solutions to it, but I haven't found that golden answer yet, but it's probably different for every personality too.
Right, right. And getting into that, would you do you or are there any other sort of creative roadblocks that you've overcome in podcasting that we might not touched on yet?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is what I do. And the way that I edit podcast is
Mhm.
not fast. It's not fast. And I think a lot of people think that it's a podcast, just throw it together and let it rip. And
Mhm.
that works for a lot of people, but I'm trying to I am in a mold where that's not the strategy.
Mhm.
And so I do find that I run into some technical issues quite a bit where um like the conversation in the podcast isn't on brand, and so then I'm having to re-edit the actual conversation structure to feel and get to a better place. Or often the biggest creative hurdle I run into though is just how does this podcast start and how does it end? Because I feel like those are two big strong points
Mhm.
in it. And then the way that always is, I always really focus on, like I said, the brand. And so I almost see the podcast intro as like a 7-second super sexy sizzle piece for the brand itself. And so I always run into issues with how can I best represent this brand in
Mhm.
3 to 7 seconds.
Yeah. Oh, totally. No, I definitely would agree with that. Are there any sort of specific editing flows for that you would throw on a podcast that makes it easier for you?
Yeah, no, and honestly, this is my favorite part about it is when you do get to work on something so consistently, like you build these great systems.
Mhm.
My biggest tool that I use right now, and I only use it for cut one, is Autopod. If you're familiar with that,
Mhm.
a Premiere plugin that just it doesn't do a good job with the wide shots. I feel like where two guests are in the same shot. It is on there, but I find if you have two camera angles, Autopod just puts on who's speaking, right?
Mhm.
Puts them on video or front audio, and it's amazing the time that it saves. I don't think it does anything creatively for me because I then go through there and edit everything on my own. But like the logistical, just like deleting and moving things up on the right timeline that it does for me is incredible. Then another one I've been really liking lately is Captioneer for when I'm cutting stuff for down for socials. I always
Mhm.
put on branded captions that use the same brand colors, the same brand font. And if there's possible animation that I feel like fits the brand better, I'll use that animation. And Captioneer is a really great tool that a guy named Nick Dean that I'm buddies with on Twitter created. It's on AE Scripts. It's just so nice for captions and it's
Yeah.
fun.
I like for instance, I use Descript and that's been my main tool for
Hmm.
editing podcasts since you can just cut a lot of the fluff out and really navigate that story on it almost like a Word document. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
I wanna so honestly, we can't close this podcast off yet because I wanna get into engagement strategies and monetization tips because let's be real, I have yet to figure out besides the traditional business to business monetization process, how can podcasters use their video content to attract sponsors and generate revenue?
So that is a great question. And you know what? Like part of why I focus solely on brands and businesses for podcasts is because that's a hard question to answer. And my expertise lies in helping brands market themselves with video.
Mhm.
And that's what I do with podcasts. So I'm absolutely stepping outside of my comfort zone by even answering that. But what I would do if I was in charge of a podcast right now and we had to monetize, I would think the most important thing would be to have you want to lower that risk for your potential sponsors. And what does that for them is you need views. Views are hard to get in big numbers. So I would want to make sure that I am really honed in on a niche topic with a very confident answer as to who is my audience. And I would try to really work on that in a lot of ways, do some research to figure out, okay, if I shift 3% to the right, does that hit harder with this audience? And once I get a better idea of what that is, just drill into that area through consistency. I'd honestly probably be more concerned about quantity for a while versus quality
Mhm.
to a degree. I'd probably be just pumping out one more episode than I feel comfortable with a month so I can try to build that audience up. Because I think the answer at the end of the day is it's going to take patience and consistency. I don't think you can just be like, you know what, I got a goal of 2 months. I'm going to watch this podcast, and in 2 months, I'm going to have it monetized. I think that's like a 6 to 18 month goal. and it's not easy. But if you're really aligned in a really particular niche to where you don't need to have 10,000 views to look impressive, but you're talking in some really high ticket, really small area, and you're getting 180 views, but there are people who are interested in this highly targeted niche, like those 180 views can be way more powerful than 10,000 views. So I think I would shift the direction of my podcast to be ultra niche in an area that's highly specific, and then
Mhm.
look for companies that fit that mold,
Right.
or go the opposite direction and just try to do big clickbaity things until it works.
What's interesting with what you mentioned about having a smaller size audience, and I could relate with it taking 6 to 18 months because that's generally a lot of people want results right away. But the biggest thing that I've noticed is when you cast a wide net of a huge audience, you not that having a huge audience is bad, but it muddies the water a bit of who exactly is your target customer. And if you're
Absolutely.
trying to get a sponsorship, whether you're getting a sponsorship and the brand is underwriting it, which is just another word for a sponsorship. There's so many
Mm-hmm.
words out there that I think actually confuses people, but
I'm with you.
underwriting basically is the way that the podcast that I work with makes money, and that podcast being on their website will generate another network of a guest. Might like, hey, we just landed this architect person who can build us a $5 million power plant. Wow, you just sold us on that deal. So it's like
Uh-huh.
that risk is there's not really any risk. They're paying the podcasting crew to whatever they need, but then their exponential return is just a lot higher. So that I could see how that would work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a great example too. They only need to get one fish in the net
Mhm.
to hit it big.
Yeah.
So they're just casting a wide net. Yeah.
And then I guess way that you would ensure that editing process aligns with your podcasting broad or business or goals, how would you ensure that the editing process aligns with that goal that they're looking for? When we might have already answered it earlier,
Well,
but
a way I like to think about it is I feel like, so you've got a brand, right?
Mhm.
Every single touch point of your brand needs to look and feel the same. If you use orange, bright orange text with this big fat bold font, you better use it everywhere, because it's like a subconscious symbol. It's like what branding is all about at the end of the day, is that's a subconscious signal to the brain. That's my company. That's the company that I'm interested in right now. And if for whatever reason you've got a website or a landing page and it's your big fat orange font, and then you open up a podcast and it's like bossa nova music and sexy cursive, like it's just not, you're completely detached from what you've done everywhere else. So I would always make sure that my editing decisions align with the
Mhm.
brand as a whole, so that it looks the part, feels the part, and fits like a glove into everything else they're already doing.
Mhm. And I think that's even tough when you're either a content creator on your own who's creating a podcast, is because your podcast brand might be different than your brand that you have on your gaming channel. And that's actually the biggest hurdle that I'm dealing with now is I willingly chose to put this podcast that talks about content creation, monetization, business entrepreneurial stuff on a channel that was dedicated to video game stuff.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
But the biggest challenge and the only way around that, because here for me, what it was is this is a little bit of just the laziness part of it, but also the fact that I'm just like, I just also don't see a point in spreading it out too thin. Is
Mm-hmm.
my main channel is already monetized, so I could just throw those episodes as bonus content for people to watch
There you go.
if
Uh-huh.
people do it. And then the focus of the actual branding for the podcast is going to be on its own website, its own page, and that's going to be the primary source. And that's just how I'm trying to balance with that.
Yeah, that's a conundrum there, but it sounds like you have a good little, you got a reason behind what you're doing, and that's the most
Yeah,
important part,
y-
right? But yeah,
definitely.
you probably could do a podcast and focus solely on gaming personalities, and that it would rip on the channel. Who
Hmm.
knows? Who knows?
Yeah, this one is insights, and then there will probably be one in the future called spotlights, which is more focused on the celebrity side of stuff. and then
Uh-huh.
asking them, and it's going to be a more shorter, condensed version of this because celebrities don't have all the time in the world. It'd be awesome.
It's hard enough to get anyone as a podcast guest, let alone a busy, successful person.
Oh, 100%. One of the things that I find fascinating with you, and we've even talked about this on our previous call, was your experience with high profile brands such
Mm.
as Disney, Meta, NFL. And just tell me a little bit, like, how did you land that kind of thing? What made you go from dropping everything from what you've done in the past to just work as a podcaster now?
Oh, yeah. So, like, why am I leaving? I guess I'm technically like, yeah, why am I leaving working with these big brands in the name of working with podcasting? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was a hard answer. It was like a hard question to answer myself. But ultimately, the reason why is, and truth be told, I just got off a job 3 days ago with the LA Galaxy soccer team in LA. So have I walked away? No. But did I put myself in a position where I can say yes or no to jobs that excite me? That's what I'm angling towards more, because at the end of the day, not those big companies we mentioned, but there's big companies. I typically work with large Fortune 500 companies, and as cool as that sounds, and as much as it draws more eyeballs towards you and your service, like, the work environments can be pretty brutal in that world. You can be on net 90 payments, where I finished the job in late July.
Hmm.
I still haven't been paid for it yet because it took so long to process the invoice.
Hmm.
And once the invoice is processed, then it's 90 days.
Oof.
So you get to deal with payment coming hundreds of days after you finish a job, which can either be
Hmm.
a pleasant surprise or an absolutely brutal experience.
Yeah.
Then often you'll agree on a flat rate. Seems like a simple job. And then you have to pass through 8 levels to beat the ultimate boss of client revisions. And people in corporations tend to want to have not want to, but they feel a need to have their fingerprints on something because they're judged so prescription like on their performance.
Hmm.
And so often you'll get notes on a video that don't help. And it puts you in a position where you're like, you know what? I know that woman's wearing yellow shorts, but it really doesn't hurt the video that she has yellow shorts on. Like, we don't need to reshoot the whole thing.
Right.
There's a way I can, so people like to try to have a fingerprint on something to try to please a person above them, or have their presence felt on a project,
Hmm.
which is not ultimately serving the video.
Hmm.
Um, and I've run into that type of situation just so much. And there's times where that type of job can be awesome and sweet, and you get paid a lot in a short amount of time. And there's times where you can have this sum of money on a job and you think, wow, I'm going to make this much on a video. I'm about to just make it big. And then all of a sudden revisions go on for 4 months, and you've, lost so many opportunities because of the nature of the slow moving beast. So
Hmm.
I just put myself in a position now to try to be able to have consistent work versus like huge boulders falling into the ocean that make a big splash, which are those corporations. And it's so pleasing for me to work with people who I enjoy working with and actually see the help that they get from the videos and how excited they are about it, because very rarely is anyone at a corporation super excited about something. They're on day 784 of the same thing, and they've flatlined on their pulse. Not everyone. There's some amazing people who can push through that, but yeah, I just find it brings a lot of extracurricular activity and stress that go beyond the actual project. And I am really loving working for creators and smaller businesses, because you can see that you're actually helping someone, and it's fun to use that same toolkit and ability that I've got to work with these big companies to help the smaller areas, and scratch my back a little bit more in the terms of enjoyment I get out of work.
It's interesting you bring up the fact when it comes to bigger companies and long delays in pay because a company like Disney ain't hurting for money.
That's true.
So I guess the crazy part about that, it's like going 90 days and with these revisions, not and I imagine some of these revisions are not even included in that pay, or like you were paid up front and then all the revisions now need to be stacked the 4 month go. You're like, I already got paid. So in a weird way, I feel like I'm doing work for free.
Yeah, and mentally it can really get funny. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's what's also can be frustrating is like for right now, when I work with podcast clients, I have a payment structure where I get paid X amount up front and X amount on delivery, which puts me in a really great position for cash flow where I have cash. But again, like there was a job I worked with one of these big companies in July and it's December and I don't have my money yet. And it's just because of the time it takes to process an invoice and all their payment terms. And so no matter what or how I feel when I show up to work with these big companies, I just have to get in line with whatever they do because you can't steer that cruise ship to turn around and pivot for you. It's an unstoppable force that you just latch onto for a flash in time, and you're not going to change the way they pay you. Like they have a system that's been approved by a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. And what's cool is even though you've worked for these companies and you're still doing it, there's many insights and techniques that you have learned that you can now apply to editing podcasts for your podcast client. So,
Absolutely.
what would you say are some of those techniques that you've taken from working with something like Disney, Meta, or NFL and applied it to these?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because honestly, one of my big points I try to make with people who I work with is I worked with Meta creating long form content for 3 years with a certain project they were doing.
Mhm.
And they gave me an entire PDF to help educate me on how and why they cut content down. So I have the god of the internet, Meta's playbook on how and why to cut down long form content.
Hmm.
And I try to use that to help my clients. I'll just tell them like, hey, I got the playbook from the master themselves on how they cut down content. And it's nothing that's insane that no one's ever heard of, but it's a formula that I've got a hold of that I like to use as a little bragging, if you will.
Yeah.
But that's one way, is like that, like a literal way. But ultimately, the thing that helps me the most is just I've run into so many opinions from so many people, and I don't feel too shook
Hmm.
from many people these days, and I can keep a calm mindset through
Hmm.
some not fun situations.
Yeah. One of I think the biggest fear and something going back to the more income side is one of the clients I work with who was targeting companies that earn say $5 million plus, right? It's mainly just
Mm-hmm.
because for the amount of money getting that high ticket podcast client to pay you a substantial amount, but also it guarantees that if the amount they're receiving, it's worth the effort on going with a podcast. One of the difficulties being a smaller creator, though, is that if you're somebody who's targeting other smaller creators or YouTubers per se, a YouTuber might not have the budget of a huge multi-million dollar company or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. So I guess the question is to relate with that is how can a smaller creator adopt strategies from high profile brands or even high or what like Roberto Blake likes to say, big creator energy to even get enough money to support their lifestyle or pay their bills because you're not going to be you might get fortunately lucky and be like, oh wow, this client wants to pay me like $2,000 $3,000, and you might feel you're worth less even though you're not, and you're like, how to pricing that is very difficult. So how can a smaller creator adapt some of those strategies?
That's tough because at the end of the day, I like at a certain point, like budget becomes the answer to
Hmm.
some things. So then if it's not budget that's going to unlock those doors for you, then it's time.
Hmm.
And you got to have time to either learn how to do it yourself, which is really hard to learn how to encapsulate some person you could purchase their service that's got 12 years of experience. Try to bottle that up into something that you're going to do yourself is hard.
Hmm.
But is it impossible? No. I think that the goal is like, if you can't afford it, you're going to have to find a way to be more creative to make what you've got work for you. And that can be a hard question to answer, but there's definitely, I feel like whatever you want to do is possible at any price point, as long as your expectations are realistic at said price point. Um, but it's a hard answer because it's always ends up the answer ends up being money or time. And creativity can be a little bit of a wormhole that fights the two of those a little bit to make it an uneven battle in your favor.
Right. And at that point, if you at least have the money and you're willing to help more people out, outsourcing that might actually better because you can get money back, but you can't get time back.
That's right. And if you're going to try to learn how to, let's just use podcasting, for example, if you're a big creator who's killing it on Instagram with the specific type of content and you're ready to start a podcast, but now you're spending 6 hours a day learning how to use Premiere Pro so you can do what you want to, and you're losing your ability to keep that consistency on your social media page, are you really saving money at that point, or are you losing money?
Hmm.
And that becomes a fight that's difficult.
Yeah, and that's been my story because I'm somebody that doesn't have the budget of a big studio. I am a small
Hmm.
time creator in my house, paying high enormous amount of rent because I live in
That's right.
California.
Yes, yes, sir.
And one of the things that I have experienced, love it or hate it, is using AI and how
Hmm.
AI has been a way to. I hate the word mimic, but you start doing it even up to that level because there's not really a huge barrier to get into audio podcasting, but learning the strategies and tools with AI or getting the tools that are much cheaper so you can automate or backlog whatever the process
Hmm.
is. And that's, I think, the biggest key aspect of it.
I agree 100%. Yeah. Then AI can really help you unlock with through creativity some cool things,
Hmm.
right? But it's tough. And then it gets overwhelming once you find out all the tools at your disposal. Like you can get decision fatigue in a heartbeat.
Right. Is there anything that we did not discuss on this podcast so far that you feel like we may have not covered enough or you would like to bring up? Definitely feel free to shoot up your socials and your plugs on your website. I would love to help
Fun.
you out.
Hey, yeah, my main plug is Cut the Pod. That's my podcast service for brands, is what I like to say. So if you're a business, just someone who's selling something and you've got a podcast that needs to be stronger, or you haven't started a podcast yet, like I like to help people make podcasts that look like them so that they can sell what they sell and make their traditional marketing more effective. And that's what I'm all about. And you can use that cutthepod.com. And that's my handles on all socials, Cut the Pod. So find me there, Cut the Pod.
That is awesome. Yeah. Cut the Pod. Definitely check them out. I ran across this guy through Twitter or X, and it's been a trip how the networking has just been slowly building and
Isn't it?
evolving.
I know. It's like magnetic forces pulling towards one another.
What was a trip about that too when I looked on X, and every time I would post something about a particular topic, and I'm noticing their algorithm is a little bit. I'm starting to pick up on their algorithm. Say you start posting about money or you make a post about podcast money and blah 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 blah. Immediately after I send that post, I will get other similar posts of what I posted shown up in
Hmm.
my feed. For instance, when I had found you, I was already making a post about a podcast, and then all of a sudden, this guy shows up. I'm like, "Cut the pod," and I start reading your tweets. I'm like, "Okay, I can resonate with this. This sounds good." So it's just like networking and linking people together.
That's absolutely right. And it's funny to close on all that and loop it all around is I feel like podcasting is just the ultimate networking tool.
Hmm.
Not that it's how we met. We met through X, but it's such a good tool to get you to talking to people and just learn how to show up consistently and have access to people because they get to feel like they're on the spotlight. It's a good tool.
Sound is awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think we could pretty much close. I think we could pretty much close this podcast up unless you have any couple questions for me, and then that's pretty much it.
You know what? The main thing I've got over here that I wrote down twice from you is the putting the podcast on the website and the effect that has for people. I think that's such a awesome,
Hmm.
simple like tool because it makes the podcast part of their identity, and all of a sudden they probably feel more responsibility to keep up with it. I
Yeah.
think that's such a cool thing, and that's what you do with all. That's like almost like one of your first mandates with the client. You said,
Yeah, and we've had a lot of issues where people would be very reluctant to do that, but their main big client that we work with, which is a company that goes by Saraclad, which is the show that we do for the art. It's called Architecture and Innovation, and
uh huh,
I just do the recording and editing for it, like similar to what we're doing right here. And I put
right,
them in like audiograms. It's all audio only. And what we do is we set it up, and those I give them the RSS feed, and they send up and they have it on their website. So within a week or two after posting, they just have it on their website, and they include it in their newsletters. They have a whole brochure now of all the guests that they've had on our shows, and
wow,
it's
yeah,
just it's crazy. And from what I heard, I don't know too much about the details, but they have closed like this like huge deal with building a power plant in the U.S. I'm like, oh my god!
Wow.
And this is a company that's owned by Panasonic. So I'm like, oh,
Yeah. Wow.
yeah.
So in hand, you're responsible for a power plant.
In a sense, yeah. Me and
Yeah.
my client are both in hand directly responsible because of the podcast.
I love that. And that's what
Yeah.
they can do. They can do a lot of things, those podcasts.
Now I'm just convincing him to increase those prices and be like, "Yo, you need to ask for more, bro."
Dude, yeah, our podcasts build power plants.
Well, that brings us to the end of another insightful episode of the Creative Corner Insight. I just want to give a huge thanks to George Boyd for sharing his wealth of knowledge about the process of video editing, storytelling, and the art of just creating impactful podcasts. I will definitely have you on again at some point.
Please do.
From his experiences working with iconic brands to Disney, Meta, and NFL, to his expertise in crafting content that resonates with audience, he has truly shown us the power of combining creativity with strategy. If you guys enjoyed this episode and want to learn more about George's work, be sure to check out Cut the Pod and explore how video editing can elevate your podcasting game. Thank you guys for tuning in, and as always, if you found value in this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with somebody who might benefit from it. Until next time, keep creating, keep innovating, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Creative's Corner Insights.